Good evening. My name is Mridu Jangyani. I'm the founder of Terrarium. How many of you have heard or been to a Terrarium event? So Terrarium is essentially a startup platform where we support founders, scale ventures in the alternative materials space. And one of the sectors that we look at is food and ag. And that's why this partnership with GFI has been super exciting for us to get to the depth that we'd like. And I'm sure with the GFI team and the panel that's coming together, it's going to make for a wonderful evening. And yeah, if you'd like to know more about Terrarium, I'm going to be around. Would be happy to talk to any of you that's interested in the material space. And with that, I'll hand it back. Thank you.
Thanks, Madhu. Thank you. And just before we start off the panel, a little bit about what this event is about. It's a GFIdeas event, and the entire point of convening an ecosystem is what GFI India does, and GFIdeas event is the culmination of that, where we believe convening these events, getting the community together, is something that's really useful and resourceful in terms of scaling up a nascent sector. Right now, the community is about 1,100 people. Some of you are part of the community. It's happy to see you in a physical space rather than over on LinkedIn. But it's a real pleasure to see you being part of that community as well as participating here today. So without any further ado, I'd like to start off the panel. I know we're a bit late, but let me go ahead and introduce the panel. So the real reason we looked at an exploratory dialogue on advancing smart proteins from allied sectors is really for the sector to think beyond beyond its realms, or sort of people who've been thinking about the sector for a while. The real reason is to look at these few successful sectors, particularly in India, that have scaled in the last 15 years, and seeing what learnings or sort of understandings you can get from these sectors. In order to do that, it's my pleasure to introduce today Apoorv Shaligram. Apoorv is a scientist with a background in material sciences, having studied at Michigan State University, as well as in IIT Roorkee. He's a co-founder of e-TRNL, a company established in 2021, which focuses on groundbreaking advancements in material sciences. Next, we have Vikram Dileepan. Around a hand. A prominent figure in the impact investing space. He's a director of Low Capital, an organization he founded in 2004, dedicated to driving positive social change through investment. Vikram also has a notable entrepreneurial background, having founded a successful and scaled up a company called Solar Town, a residential rooftop solar startup, to over 500 pin codes in India's top 15 tier 1 cities. Lastly, we have Dr. Fatima J. She's an alumna of IISc with a background in plant biotechnology. Dr. Fatima works closely with the Karnataka Innovation and Technology Society as the forefront of developing innovative molecular diagnostic and genomic solutions at Azuka Biolabs. Her work, and lastly, we have Radhika Ramesh, our own GFI's policy specialist, to take over the stage. So over to you, Radhika.
Hi everyone, thank you once again for joining. I think those who have not been acquainted with the smart protein sector, we hope that introduction was useful. Smart protein is going to be used interchangeably with all protein, which is what it's known globally. It basically includes 3 production platforms. One is plant-based protein, one is fermentation-derived proteins, and one is cultivated, or what is commonly known as cell culture or lab-grown meat, which is a very terrible term for it. So today we have these expert panelists. We're really hoping to kind of dig into their minds to take some learnings. The 2 main challenges that we face in the smart protein sector is one is financing and one is infrastructure development, which is also the theme of the discussions we've had earlier today. We've had 2 focus group discussions that brought along a lot of the experts from the smart protein sector, and here we really wanted to look external to hear if they have any thoughts and learnings. So with that, I'll just get started. Sorry, I'm a little out of breath. So we'll start with Apoorv. Apoorv, you've been working in a technology segment that's been booming since the last decade or so, but actually the real demand is only going to skyrocket in the next 2 decades. So can you tell us how your vision for your product has evolved, especially aligning with the Indian market's needs? And sorry, we have only one mic. So.
So, by the way, thank you everyone for joining in. Quick introductions, right? So, I'm Apoorv. Before I started e-TRNL, I was working in the space of batteries and EVs for almost 12 years. And have seen this sector evolve. So, as you say, it's right. It has been booming over the past 5 years compared to the 10 years before that. But I mean, if we actually look at it, right, it's only a couple of segments of the market which has been booming in the EV space. EVs have hit about 5% penetration in India today, and but if we put it on a bell curve, it's the two extremes of the market which have been converting to EVs. And there's a reason for that. I mean, it's probably that we are not understanding what the market wants. The needs of the two extremes are met. It's either people who want advanced EVs, performance vehicles, or it's people who are looking for the real commercial side of things, where you can make most of the savings from electric vehicles. But the mid of the market, the personal vehicle space is still kind of lacking. So, I mean, that in mind, we try to understand what is it that EVs require. And one of the things that we came up with was in the Indian space, in the Indian sector, charging and safety were the two big problems that we had to solve for. That is the convenience of charging and the mental safety, that the vehicle will not catch fire. Those two things had to be worked on. So that's what we targeted when we started e-TRNL. And at e-TRNL, what we've been trying to do is we're trying to make batteries with the same chemistries per se. By the way, no change over there. So that, I mean, it also makes it easier for the rest of the EV industry to adopt the product. But to put them in a different manner to improve the efficiency of the product. In one way that we work on is that batteries, when we try to charge them too fast, they heat up. And our solution was that, okay, we try and make batteries that do not heat up in the first place rather than trying to cool them in different ways. So that was the goal. And again, I mean, it has to be done very fast. Sustainable technologies, again, have a kind of a timer that is ticking. And we have to do it, we have to make sure that the adoption also happens very fast. So we also focused on the manufacturing aspect. How can this technology scale up really fast? And again, like the EV sector also faces the same problem, with financing, with access to capital. So how can we break through on that? So that's also something which has been the core of our thesis at e-TRNL.
Thank you. I think you've touched upon like two important aspects of that segment, which is convenience and safety. Safety is also important in alternative proteins, but convenience definitely is. The whole idea of a shift in our food systems requires products that can offer you the nutrition, the convenience, the taste, the cost that comes. So in terms of a food systems revolution, I think it's a similar learning also for the all protein sector. Dr. Fatima, could you share your journey transitioning from a research scientist working at the lab to then becoming an entrepreneur who developed innovative molecular diagnostics during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic? And additionally, how do you observe that the biotech ecosystem, how has it been like evolving both from an innovator side and from the government awareness, adoption, support side of things?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. So, I'm a scientist at heart. I've always been. I've always been, and I'm still one, and that's what I do. I do what I really enjoy doing. So, I think the most difficult transition for me was to unlearn a lot of things that I had with my typical academic mindset once I started with my entrepreneurial journey. So the journey was not planned. I didn't plan to become an entrepreneur. However, my co-founder and my friend from school I should say inspired me, or he calls it to be an idea virus. So he infected me with a virus saying that, why do you want to go behind publications? Why don't we create some impactful products from India? And that's how we started the journey of Azuka, to create some premium molecular biology products or biotechnology products from India, because India is always known as a Me Too economy or a copycat economy most of the times. So with that vision, we started Azuka, and yeah, it's been a 360-degree, or I don't know if there are more degrees, that much of learnings and changes. The most difficult part was the unlearning, right? Most of the time in the entrepreneurial journey, I think there's a lot of unlearning that we have to do and relearn many things. And especially business was something that I absolutely had no clue about, because I was a hardcore academician. So it took me more than 5 years to really bring that shift in my mindset and learn and begin to understand what business was. Having said that, we started Azuka in 2016. We are an IAC invested and incubated company. I think with the help of IAC's incubation arms support, our journey has come this far. So what I see in the ecosystem is, yes, Bangalore is known to be the biotech capital of India. Having said that, when we look at a lot of reports, even the latest bioeconomy report, you'll find that most of the biotech economy or the bioeconomy comes from services sectors and not from product-based sectors. So that is what we are seeing, a change and shift in that kind of scenario for the past 5 to 10 years, primarily after COVID, where we see a lot of medtech and other health tech innovative companies, product-based companies coming up. However, that's still been a challenge, right? Even when we see a lot of products that come out of India, again, are they innovation-based? Are they intellectual property-based? That's another thing to think about. So we also have a lot of companies which just procure products from China or Korea and resell. So is innovation really happening in the biotech domain from India? Maybe 5 to 10% of that kind of innovation is happening. And that's primarily because I think the ecosystem, especially when it comes to the funding ecosystem and understanding the space, is a big gap. When that's what we see, right? People don't understand biotechnology, or a common man or an investor cannot relate to biotechnology, and that's a challenge we are still struggling with. But I think the government is taking a lot of initiatives. So we have a lot of grants in the biotech segment now, with the Startup India portal associated with Department of Biotechnology, Department of Science and Technology give a lot of grants, such as the Biotechnology Ignition Grant, which is a equity-free money of up to 50 lakhs for you to take an idea to POC. So you have India Innovates Growth Program, that's again 25 lakhs in grant and 25 lakhs for a trip to MIT and Harvard, so that the entrepreneurs can get exposed. So these kind of grants and a lot of programs are being run, but I would still say that innovation in this domain is still a struggle, primarily because of lack of understanding, lack of resources, financial resources, sometimes also talent, and probably scaling up is again a challenge, with regulatory hurdles being a big bottleneck.
Thank you so much. I think you've covered all the major challenges that is quite, it's not unique to one sector. It's all present in the biotech sector. And I really liked your earlier point about the Me Too economy. It's the first time I'm hearing that phrase in that scenario, but it's really true. Even for all protein, it's really important to create products that are adapting to the Indian context and not try and mimic what happened in the West, because the consumer segment, the awareness, the category awareness is vastly different. So that's interesting that it's similar there. Vikram, you began your entrepreneurial journey with a vision for self-sufficiency in affordable and accessible solar technology, to now evaluating innovation from an impact investor lens. The climate funding landscape must have evolved drastically. So could you take us through that journey and also speak to the role of government support, especially through public financing, especially for ventures that you have led yourself?
No, thank you. First of all, thanks for having me today. Great turnout, and I'm glad this ecosystem is coming together, even if it's very much at the essence of what it is in India right now. A little bit of an introduction about myself and what we do. Like you pointed out, I started as an entrepreneur about 12 years back. This was a rooftop solar energy firm, which largely turned out to be, at that point of time, I would say commercial, industrial, and maybe small residential rooftop financing, building out infrastructure, owning and operating it for them. In India, I think it was very much at the nascency or the beginning days of solar as a sector itself. And I think this originated in 2005 and 2006. By the time another decade passed, people started to understand that there was a solution around solar that they could adopt for their own roofs, for their own homes and commercial establishments, right? And over the years, what I've also done is essentially successfully handed over that company to a larger company which wanted to get into the space, and we built out that platform further. And over the past 4 or 5 years, I've been at low capital now. At low capital, we have been investing in impactful sectors for the past 20 years. We have 4 funds up and running. This is our 4th fund, and within that fund, we look at climate as a subsector of creating impact in India. And energy, alternative proteins, materials, circular economy, environmental tech, all of this fall under the ambit. And we usually invest in growth stages in these innovative companies. To address the question of role of government, from what we have seen closely, when solar began in India, it was mostly funded by government. In the sense that the B2G demand creation aspect was so strong, that led to the creation of an economy on the supply side in India. Mind you, this was in late 2000s and early 2010s. At this point of time, technology innovation or the tech stack creation of what a solar cell is or what an inverter or power system is, this was pretty much non-existent. Most of the technology came from developed countries, like what you pointed out. And the supply chain was slowly but steadily being monopolized, and to a certain extent still is monopolized in China. So India figured out what it was good at, which is demand creation via government tenders, and asked the entrepreneurs to capitalize on that demand creation by making use of the strengths of the tech imported as well as the supply imported at as low a cost as possible, and built out the products and services in India, primarily catering to the government. So what that did was to essentially create a supply chain localized in India, which could then be applied to the smaller scale sectors, which was non-government led, like the commercial or the industrial sector. And that is the version of what we see today as a solar industry. And if I were to probably think about electric vehicles too, a certain portion of demand is still being led by government, right? On the buses and the trucks and so on and so forth. And that has a cascading effect to creating a supply chain. I think it's essential to note that we will see very similar dynamics in all new industries, especially one that our country is trying to indigenize and localize. Yeah.
Thank you for taking us through that. That's very interesting. I think for all protein, right now, at least the products seem like they are catering to a very niche segment. So while we agree that public financing is really crucial for the sector to grow, in terms of government adoption, I think there are parallels that we can draw, because smart protein, all protein also rests on the fact that it's a nutritious choice for India, because in terms of having affordable protein, nutritious food products, I think we're still not really reached there. So that's an interesting thing that the smart protein sector could potentially explore. Kind of moving on to the next theme, which is around financing. So during the pandemic, people really started looking at their consumption patterns and lifestyles, and there were these internal shifts towards more greener technologies like renewables. That's also the period that saw a lot of interest in all protein, both from investments and innovators coming up in that space. Although the global funding for climate tech has been staggering ever since, as per our current sources, the total investments in all protein is around 16.1 billion, and only a mere fraction of that in India, which is around 32 million. So this is for Apoorv and Dr. Fatima. We'd be interested to hear on your perspective as entrepreneurs, how is it really navigating scaling up and scaling up your products, your technology, and the infrastructure when funding might be drying up, capital might be drying up in your respective sectors? So maybe I'll hand it to Dr. Fatima first.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, but a very difficult, or I should say it was the most difficult challenge for us, right? It's always a challenge being in this space. We have to work with minimal resources, human resources as well as financial resources, but at the same time keep moving forward and progressing. So that's the most challenging part of it. However, for us, I think personally for Azuka, our association with the SID was very critical. That's the innovation wing of Indian Institute of Sciences. So it was during COVID that a lot of companies usually reach out to such incubators primarily to see where they can deploy their CSR funds and such things. So I think we were lucky because we got some CSR grants with which we could actually acquire a small acquisition of an already existing manufacturing unit, which was funded by the CSR grant. So we didn't have to go through the stringent regulatory and that process. So this helped us to scale from 0 to 1 million units within 6 months' time. So that's how we scaled up. We were primarily an IP-based company. So we thought that we are going to only build IP and never going to get into manufacturing. But however, COVID pushed us into manufacturing because that was the need of the hour. And it also helped us understand and revisit our own business model. So I think associating with, having these kind of associations with incubators does help. So we've survived primarily on government grants and awards that come with money. So not only Indian grant and award applications. So say for example, you have MIT challenges, there is a Hello Tomorrow challenge, a Slingshot. So there are a lot of global challenges that come with a lot of, or a considerable amount of prize money, which usually helps you navigate through these challenging times. Having said that, but we've still struggled, or we have struggled with bank loans or any other type of alternative funding, primarily because although there are a lot of policies saying that startups have to be provided with collateral-free loans, Stand Up India, I don't know, for women entrepreneurs, State Bank had a big hoarding, but when you go to them, you definitely have to have a collateral. So this kind of funding was inaccessible to us. So it's only through grants and challenges that we've navigated through these times. And yeah, of course, some friends and family and fools maybe who trusted us blindly have helped us during tough times. So that's how we've navigated. But I think nowadays, more than the government grants, the CSR grants, and these challenges do bring in some considerable amount of money.
Thank you. I think you mentioned it, that even in the smart protein sector, a lot of the government grants are kind of the backbone. But yes, it's not that accessible, or the quantum of funds is still not sufficient for scaling up. I'll pass it over to Apoorv now.
Yeah, I mean, funding is one of those difficult topics to talk about, right? So, I mean, you know, when we started e-TRNL, this was my first, it was actually my second foray into the startup world. But it was the first time I was actually talking to investors, trying to raise funds. And batteries being this one field, you know, where you need a significant quantum of capital available before you can even set up a lab. So the money is not going into hiring talent or doing R&D, it is going into just setting up facilities first. But then, I mean, a few of the learnings from my previous stints kind of helped over here, you know. So I did a stint at IIT Bombay as a researcher between 2013 to 15, where we had set up what was probably India's third facility where you could fabricate lithium-ion battery cells. It was the first where you could make them in the pouch format, which is the format that goes into our mobile phones and laptops today. And the budget that we had was like 40 lakh rupees. Good thing was space was available. which was again not much, but fine. I mean, we had place to put the machines up, but we had to make sure that we got everything that we needed in that amount. Was difficult. There were a lot of corners cut in the sense that it was not going to make like state-of-the-art, world-class battery cells. But we knew that it would take us through to the milestones that were expected from the project. And once those milestones were actually achieved, there was a further quantum of funding which came in, which went into expanding that lab. And today the facilities that stands at IIT Bombay, I mean, I would say that's truly world-class. Something similar in my stint at Aether as well, where we had to actually set up something from scratch. This time around, I was also hunting for space. What kind of facilities are required when you want to set up an R&D lab in India? At least in that sense, IIT Bombay was probably better. And then comes e-TRNL. So one thing that I learned is, yes, we do not have access to as much capital as, say, people in some of the other more advanced countries. And I used to think, I always used to think of it from my perspective, why is this capital not available? Over the past 3 years, I've started to understand the other side of the table. Why people do not have any experience of deep tech startups winning in India. And that kind of explains, I mean, there is no wins that people have seen, so why should people invest in something? They have not seen any of the investments succeed. And that kind of makes it even more difficult for us. It kind of also makes it imperative for us to succeed against the odds so that the ones who follow after us also get access to that capital, right? So my learning was this, try and break down the journey into the milestones that are significant enough to move to the next level, significant enough to act as wins where you can raise more capital, but try and achieve those milestones in as less as possible. So for example, I don't know exactly what kind of R&D happens in alternative proteins, but I probably assume that on day one, you do not need that fancy clean room lab. Exactly. Okay, so that's where we have to actually start thinking about what kind of milestones are we talking about. Can we achieve a milestone with a semi-clean lab? Because that significantly cuts down the capital you need on day one. Okay, so here's what. Again, in batteries, we need a very, very clean space because even a speck of dust can cause a battery to explode at some point of time. But so when we started setting up a lab which had like a couple of air purifiers right next to the place where we needed the clean space. So the rest of the space, let it be dusty, that's fine. But as long as the place where the electrodes were fabricated, for example, that small region is clean, you're still going to show some significant results. Again, nobody expects you to show a cell that's going to run a Tesla on day one. But as long as you have managed to showcase that you made a cell in, say, like $500,000 or $1 million, that's actually a very, very big deal, because if we look at the space worldwide, there are people who are spending 10 times that amount trying to achieve that same objective. And that's kind of where, that Indian DNA kind of kicks in, where we are known to try and get things done in very small costs. And yeah, but that's where our understanding of technology kind of comes into the picture. What exactly is required? A lot of times, when we say that, we need like full clean rooms, or in case of batteries, like full dry rooms, do we truly need them? And what is the impact of not having it? So like, at IIT Bombay, the first few cells we made were in Mumbai, like 70-75% humidity, forget dry rooms. And we realized that, okay, it charges once, it discharges, and then it dies. But the fact was it charged once and it discharged once, which means that, we are able to make cells right. It is probably that now if we have a better facility, we are actually going to make it a lot better. So And again, I mean, sometimes, lack of access to capital, lack of access to resources makes us efficient in ways we do not understand. Very, very creative. So again, an example, right? So there is, in batteries, there is this particular chemistry that is used for very, very high energy density batteries, which is extremely moisture sensitive. You need to have dry rooms with a sub 10% humidity entire sections for you to be able to make electrodes, even make electrodes. Okay, forget working cells. We actually managed to use that chemistry once, make electrodes, make cells, run them, and test them past the point where they kind of beat LG and Panasonic on performance probably. And all of this was made with a dehumidifier that barely managed to keep it at 30%. So it was eventually, right, I mean, yes, if I have a dry room with that specification, I get through. But what is the actual threshold? What is that point where you can actually make this work? That may be much lower. And yeah, I mean, that was the learning. I mean, like, it helps us understand the science better as well.
Thank you. I think you've talked about like the Indian way of doing things, which may or may not be good at all times. But yes, I think it's similar even for all protein, because it's food. It does require very controlled conditions for R&D, especially in cultivated or fermentation-derived proteins. But I think one thing that you said in an earlier conversation is that if you create a solution in an Indian context, you can pretty much apply it anywhere else in the world. So that means that product is the best quality that you can really provide, even with global standards. So I think that was an interesting perspective, and it really combines everything that you just mentioned. To kind of, again, close the financing bit, want to ask Vikram, you are an impact investor, and you've met with certain all-protein startups, and you've studied the ecosystem a fair bit. Now, despite the downturn in investment in all protein since about 2022, investors say they are still interested in all protein, but they will invest in ideas that kind of signify some kind of difference in the offering, represent some new thinking, right? So could you share some thoughts and advice for the smart protein community that are looking to fundraise, and how can they keep up with these new market expectations in order to grow and scale?
Thank you. Absolutely. I think what Apoorv mentioned is very true, in the sense that we are just seeing the first cohort of deep tech companies, so to speak, in India. And what that means is, as long ago as even 10 years, we didn't even have a sizable cohort of deep tech resources or talent or companies starting up in India. We're just seeing the wave of that happening now. And it's understandable that therefore we don't have a demonstrated success of a portfolio of deep tech companies, right? And unfortunately, that timing has sort of coincided with the global macro timing also lagging around on the liquidity front. So what that means is that capital is now more or less flying to safety rather than emerging risks or alternative risks, especially in countries like India and Southeast Asia. And so tying back to the point, when one goes to raise capital, the question is really, what are you trying to prove? And what kind of capital do you need to prove that milestone, right? So if you're doing something which is very deep in creating IP and technology, then you need to approach it in a tiered manner. And you need to look at, first, do you have enough attention from Indian deep tech funds, so to speak, who are looking at specifically creating IP towards a certain milestone. And from that point on, it means that when you get out of the lab, you get to pilot commercialization. What is the timeline that it would take? Now, is that timeline conducive for, let's say, an early stage seed fund or a VC fund to come in? And then when you get to pilot commercialization, then you're looking at, how do I get to scale? And what kind of scale or growth capital do I need to get to? And can I demonstrate the kind of growth that they need from a certain market that I'm going after? When I look back and tie it back to my own journey, I think what we were doing was pretty simple and straightforward in terms of building, owning, operating rooftop solar infrastructure. But knocking on the doors of VCs and PEs, that was probably the wrong idea at that point of time, which I did before eventually figuring out that I need to look at family offices, or I need to look at infrastructure funds, who are much more aligned to the kind of business model and the kind of milestones of progress that I'm demonstrating, right? So it's, first of all, essential to understand exactly what you're going to do in terms of tech, or in terms of creating CapEx, or in terms of creating a service, or even in terms of creating a consumer brand, right? So there have been many examples of creating consumer brands and succeeding in food and beverages. And if one way to create a consumer brand, then whether or not it's alternative protein, you would have to demonstrate the markers of success that's involved in a consumer food and beverages brand business model, right? And that's what the consumer investors are looking for. And that's what the private equities are looking for. And if you're similarly creating something which is on the fermentation level, you would most essentially need to demonstrate how to get this tech out of the market, and what kind of milestones and resources you need to get there. So the good part is that we are now seeing deep tech funds and family offices interested in India, and we are seeing a reverse brain drain happening back to India, which means that resources who are talented, technically, proficiently working in many of these companies as elite engineers come back to India and work in Indian startups, or even start their own companies. And they are not averse to that idea. 15 years ago, if you were to pitch that idea, they would not even reply to your message. Yeah. Now they are actually having a conversation about wanting to come back, right? So all of these factors are tying in a rather good way at this point of time, and there is no other best time to start a company except a downturn. That's when you really get to start a company. We can't do it when the markets are high, because everybody is going to ask for sky high salaries at that point, right? Yeah, so I would think about it in a phased manner. I would think about it whether is it tech, is it infrastructure, is it a go-to-market strategy, what do you need capital for, and understand the return profile requirements of the fund in question, and then tie your business model back to it, and make changes if you need to. Right, so I think it's not a rather simple answer, but it's a more nuanced answer that one needs to spend some time with the capital market professionals to understand what they need to.
Thank you. I think that was very interesting, and I hope that was useful for the community in terms of working backwards. But having like a strong go-to-market strategy is definitely important, and it kind of defines your investment requirements. So now kind of moving on from financing, let's talk about some other influencing factors. So those factors are also important beyond just financing, right? So Apoorv, the battery in the EV is the most expensive component, accounting for about 50% of the total cost for that whole electric vehicle. It's directly proportional. The cost of a battery cell is proportional to the cost of that actual affordability of that vehicle. In cell culture foods, which is one segment of smart protein, one challenge that the industry says is the cell culture media is also very expensive. So cultivated meat is not something that we can really think of in terms of affordability. It's just one example. You've said before that you've identified how to drive down the capex needed to make cells by a fifth compared to how much it really costs. So what were the most influencing factors for you to achieve that?
Factors. So okay, there are two sides of the story. So one side is external factors, things like government programs and schemes. So for example, the entire EV market got its first boom because of the FAME scheme, both FAME 1 and FAME 2. So what it did is it gave some certain subsidies which allowed vehicle prices to come down and achieve parity with the existing incumbents, which were the internal combustion or the petrol or diesel vehicles. Then we are slowly moving away towards the end of FAME, and we are moving more into PLI schemes, which are ensuring that the focus comes on manufacturing of core components. These schemes are good to an extent because it gives people a certain amount of security, that the markets are going to grow, there's going to be demand, there's going to be support. But at the end of the day, I mean, a lot of these, for example, subsidies, etc. I mean, it's just artificially driving down prices. The day that support goes out, what do you do, right? And as people working in deep tech, as technologists, as inventors, it is up to us to figure out how to bring down these costs naturally and make sure that we have the right efficiencies, the right business models to solve these problems. So I guess, I mean, there are certain parallels with the all protein industry. There are certain ones which are not there. So for example, like when we started making batteries which will be charging a lot faster, like charging 10 to 15 minutes. The whole idea was that you probably now don't need a big enough battery in the car, and hence that 50% can come down. Right. I guess you cannot do that with food. You cannot say that you only need to eat half. But there was the other side of things. I mean, when we are manufacturing, and that there comes the challenge, right? The cost of the material is very high on one side, but there is also the cost of converting those materials into the end product, which is also very high, right? Now, depending on which side of the table we are we working towards making materials, or are we working towards converting it into the final product? We can actually decide to tackle that. Why is it high? One way to say is it's too high, it's not going to work, and hence I cannot get into business. The other way to look at it is, there's something wrong over here, which is why it is so high. And that's an opportunity. If I crack that science problem, I can actually be in business. I'll probably be the only one in business. Right. So, for example, I mean, with batteries, again, I was talking through the journey of what we did at IIT Bombay, what we did at Aether, and what we're doing now. It was all about our extent of, how much we understand the science, how much we understand what is going on with the manufacturing technology. And so when we were setting up that lab at IIT Bombay, we said that, okay, this is what we need. When we were doing some work at Aether, we said, okay, these are the facilities that we need. When we started e-TRNL, we said that, okay, let's cut down all of the constraints coming from external sources. Throw away all the known knowledge. This is how we do things. This is how we have to do it. We cannot change this. Just keep it all aside and said, okay, let's think of what's the best product that we want to make. And without being prejudiced by every other known way of getting there, what is a new path that we can chart out, which will be very hard because we would have to build every single thing from scratch. But can we get there in a much more streamlined manner? And that's where we came up with this whole idea, where we developed a manufacturing process where we cut down half the number of operations that went into making a battery. There was a very nice meme on this, by the way. So, I mean, how to make a battery, I mean, there were two side-by-side pictures. On one side was fried chicken, which is probably, I hope no one minds. There's fried chicken and there's electrodes and batteries. And they're like, you take chicken, you dry it. Then you put it into batter. Then you put it into oil and you dry it again. So the batter fries. You take it out, then you put sauce on top of it. So it's like dry, wet, dry, wet, dry, wet. And something very similar happens with batteries, where you take dry materials, you put it in a solvent, then you put it back and you dry it out, and then you again put it back into a second step, and so on. And what we realize is there are a lot of inefficiencies in the process. Inefficiencies that came up because of certain scenarios over the past 30 years, which made it efficient for those who were manufacturing back then. But then the rest of the world kind of, adopted the technology without asking questions. It's probably not good for you, and it's just definitely not good when we are making batteries for electric vehicles. We are making them the exact same way. What people were making for cameras and Walkmans. I mean, come on. I mean, like those film cameras and Walkmans don't even exist today. Right? We have a completely new category, new demand, new requirements. We probably should figure out a new way. So we cut down the steps by half. We took out all the steps. We identified all the steps that use a lot of energy, consume a lot of energy. Took them out, said, okay, let's find alternatives to that, which are very, very robust, require very less energy. and overall brought down brought down the inefficiencies of manufacturing to a very, very large extent. And that's kind of what helps when you want to do manufacturing at large scale. My capex comes down and my operating margins improve because of my efficiency. What that does is it allows me to scale very fast. It scale organically, and that's kind of the answer to the first part of the problem. Make businesses stand on their own and expand on their own without external capital, and that's the day when external capital is going to be attracted to you, because that's when their core demand is met, that they are going to see the value of their money multiply.
Thank you. I wonder if the same applies to the all protein sector, but really interesting thoughts. And thank you for touching upon how you really need to work on building efficiency and manufacturing and reaching like that economies of scale, and also about the government support, which may or may not be helpful in the long term. But I think those are some important influencing factors for all protein as well. Dr. Fatima, another factor is definitely taking the support from incubators, bioincubators. A lot of smart protein companies right now are being incubated at a lot of the leading incubators across the country. So wanted to understand from you, could you tell us from your experience as a biotechnologist on how well equipped the incubators are to support deep tech across technical know-how and regulatory support, which I know we've discussed is a big challenge for biotech?
Yeah, thank you. I think segments or sectors like biotech or any deep tech and even alternative proteins definitely need support from the ecosystem, right? And primarily it is now that the incubators are really being established, and I'm sure that all the biotech incubators in the country can accommodate and will be more or less helpful for alternative protein industries, because more or less similar processes will be involved. For example, I know that the Bangalore that's the BBC Bio Innovation Center has almost most of the facility. Maybe they don't have a dedicated animal cell culture facility, but I'm sure they will have all the necessary equipments that need to be set up. Similarly, CCAMP also does have that kind of an animal cell culture facility. SID's, ISC's incubator is in the process of setting up a molecular biology facility there. But for Azuka, right, for us, one big advantage or why we chose ISC over CCAMP was primarily for two reasons. Maybe those were our learnings and it can help you. For us, it was knowledge capital. Primarily, the access to interactions with the professors there and getting their advice and getting their inputs was very critical for us. So this also helped me probably giving me access to the lab there, because I continued my product development work in the lab that I did my postdoctoral fellowship itself. So which means that all the instruments or the expensive instruments and equipments that I needed, I got access to that through the incubation. Because you do give some equity to the incubator, and this facilitated the access to all the necessary infrastructure that I needed for my R&D to build my IP and file our patents. So I think that was considerably a very good support for us. So depending on your specific requirements, you should align with particular incubators. For example, we are also partnered with IKP, so IKP also has invested in us. And I think one good thing is IKP has, although IKP's focus is not totally bio, they have startups from the other sectors as well, but they do have a biotech facility. They also have strong regulatory facilities and regulatory panels that they have set up, which can help kind of startups like us to go through the regulatory landscape much easier. But having said that, I think regulatory again is a very expensive and tedious process, right? So funding again is a problem. Say for example, if I need to get an IVDR regulatory approvals. So I need a lot of money, which probably most of these incubators won't do. So what we've done to address these challenges is that we probably tried to address different segments of the market so that we become revenue positive and so on. So based on your needs, I think you can align with incubators. And I would also say that it's not only incubators, mentors also bring a lot of value, especially in the space that we are in. Like he said, right, I'm compelled to say this. Even at Azuka, we've done a lot of jugaad, especially during COVID. IISc labs, IISc was closed. Everything was closed for 2 months. And now we want to be part of this crisis. So we got associated with IISc's pandemic response team. And we definitely wanted to do something during the pandemic crisis. So we were just thinking we had to remove all our stuff from the IISc labs, and we figured out that one of our buffers was storing our samples without any cold chain, despite moving them out. So that is when we repurposed those samples, and we quickly sent it for ICMR approval for a cold chain free sample collection kit, which we call as a molecular transport medium. Because during COVID, VTMs had a lot of issues. You needed a cold chain, and there were erroneous results because the sample degraded, and that was a big problem. So we tried to address this problem. So it was interesting that how we shipped samples to ICMR. So I had no access to lab, but I had shifted all my chemicals and everything home. So I was wondering what I should do. So Swiggy was working then. I ordered a cooker on Swiggy, a new cooker on Swiggy, because I couldn't use the cookers that I was having at home to prepare chemicals and sterilize and autoclave chemicals. So I used the kitchen balance. I used the cooker. I had autoclaved and sterilized whatever reagents I prepared for one batch for approvals at home, and I really shipped it from home. And believe me, we got approvals within 15 days of time. And from then on, during COVID, we have deployed 1 million units with 0 contamination records. Although we did receive some returns, primarily on leakage, because that was another challenge, leakage of vials, but not for any product failure or performance. So that's the kind of mindset, right, you need to have. I think when you understand the science better, then you know how to work it around. So you have to play between both. So having a good understanding of what you're doing is very important when you're starting up something in the deep tech space. Unless you have that, then you will not know how to troubleshoot or how to tackle some unexpected challenges that you may get on the way. So if you mix both and use your support system and have good mentors, I think that really changes the game. So for Azuka, I think I always say, right, mentors make or break, and that is very true with Azuka. And we've had great mentors from Tata Chemicals and ISC who are still with us. So they work with us on a day-to-day basis. So that kind of an association is very important, alongside your associations with incubators, especially in this space. Because it takes a lot of time. We may, for alternative proteins, say for example, cultivated meat, you may start your experiments with some particular objectives, but your outcome is never going to be what you're expecting, right? That's what happens in the domain. At least, maybe it's not like physics or chemistry. Biology is very tricky. Biology is very tricky and complicated, and there is an interplay of so many other factors. So it becomes very important to have good advisors is something that I would like to say.
Thank you and congratulations. That was a very interesting story of your jugaad during COVID. Thank God you didn't use the same cookers.
No, I think I should thank Swiggy.
Sure.
I really thank Swiggy because otherwise it would have been a challenge. You couldn't go out. So it was a real problem.
Yeah, no, sure. Okay, so we're moving to the final segment, which is on consumer adoption. And before we throw it open to the audience, so each of your entrepreneurial ventures are somewhat focused on end consumer awareness and feasibility for mass consumer adoption. So could you share some advice on your workarounds towards how you've individually worked towards building that mass consumer adoption? For all protein, the challenge that the sector faces is that it needs to meet the taste parity, the price parity, and be as convenient as conventional animal-derived protein. So any advice that you have in under a minute for the smart protein community, that would be great. I'll start with Vikram.
Under a minute, I'll try under a minute. See, I think now having the vantage point of investing in a couple of consumer businesses as well as part of low capital, what I've come to understand is there is always, when you commercialize the market, there is always a certain cohort of consumers who will be interested. And one needs to double down on that first cohort of consumers to figure out how you can acquire them. Now, and then figure out what is the decision making or the buying process for them. How do they, what criteria do they go by when this initial cohort of consumers are trying to purchase your product? Is it distribution, accessibility, price point, taste? One needs to really understand what is driving the buying process there. And at that point of time, you might not necessarily be EBITDA profitable, but if you can still acquire that cohort of consumers fully, then you will get the advantages of scale to drive down cost structures. And then you can go to another tier of consumers, and that will give you further scale, and then you go to another tier of consumers, right? I think one who's focused on a consumer business needs to be thinking about it from this angle. Early adopter set, cost to market, and then how do you acquire that cohort of consumers before you build scale and go to the next one.
Great, thank you. Really important points. Yeah, you can pass it to.
Sure. Apoorv?
Yeah.
Okay. Understand your market. Understand what your market truly wants. Again, the world has changed very, very drastically in the past 4 years. So most of the conventional wisdom about what people thought probably doesn't hold true today. Market products according to the the taste of the audience, rather than trying just to copy something which exists. Don't be a Me Too over there. So, for example, the same product can either be marketed as a plant-based meat product, or it can be marketed as a new category of products per se. If you're marketing as plant-based product, you can't plant-based meat. You actually have to meet the taste of the consumer in terms of what they expect from meat. If it's a new product, new category, and it just says it's vegetarian, it probably opens the door to the entire vegetarian segment of the market for you, and you don't have to be, held down to the taste of meat. The other thing is, again, how do you market it? You can just market it as, okay, meat alternative, or you can market it as like some sort of a health food, superfood, which is vegetarian, high protein. That marketing can make a huge difference to how people perceive the product and how people accept it.
My tip is going to be in the lines of what Apoorv said itself, but a little more specific. I think, right, when you say alternative proteins, I think Impossible Burger has already tried and really didn't do well. So alternative itself gives a perception that it's alternative only, right? So which means that the problem statement there is not really resonating because you already have existing proteins and this is just an alternative to that. I think aligning with something like probably the obesity market, or because a lot of fermentation is involved, aligning with the prebiotic or the probiotic segment, where you are, where your problem statement is relatable, right? Being an alternative source is not a very strong problem statement unless unless a consumer is relating to a problem. I think he's not going to buy the product. So if you can relate to probably the obesity market, or say there is a lot of supplements, right? Protein supplements that come up. So you say that you eat food and you get everything that you need in the food, in this food that you're going to eat, rather than depending on supplements. Say no to supplements. Something of this kind of an alignment may probably attract a lot of interest than just calling alternative proteins is something that maybe you should all think about. Because alternative itself gives that perception. And I think you have to change that perception to something else, to a stronger connect, to bring that connect with the users. yeah, that's one thing. And as we discussed earlier, probably there is also a lot of scope where, although I don't see a great requirement for alternative proteins in India, whereas it's there in the other the Western countries, we can become a manufacturing hub. There's a lot of scope for India to be in the manufacturing space. It may be raw materials or end products or whatever goes into these alternative protein categories. Probably that's also one avenue that we can really use with the Make in India and Made in India campaigns that are really promoted well. I think you could leverage on that as well.
Thank you. Kind of questioning alternative protein in theory there, but no, we get it. I mean, a lot of alternative protein companies actually are pivoting to the broader segment.
It's not pivoting. It's just rephrasing. It's just rephrasing and realigning what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
Because what you say is what is perceived, and that perception becomes very important when you are selling something, right? How your end user is perceiving what you are selling is something that's very important. And I think if you focus a bit on that and just rephrase whatever you're saying and realign yourself to specific categories and specific problems, then I think it will be much easier.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think a lot of alternative protein companies need to kind of play their role in consumer awareness creation, the category awareness. I think that's what's been missing, especially in the Indian context. And yeah, thank you, I mean, three of you, for sharing those tips on, how the companies can position to the Indian market requirements. I think those were really helpful and very in line with what the market is facing at the moment. So before we close, I know there's some activity going around, people are getting distracted, but we want to throw it open to the audience. If you have any questions for our speakers here or anyone from the GFI India team or even Terrarium, feel free to, post that now. Okay.
So I think many thanks for sharing your insights. And I was just pondering about the parallels between EV and alternate proteins. So EVs have been around for so long, more than 100 years, and it's very focused research, right? And now it's focused on battery, right? So the electric vehicles were around in some states in the US. I understand 1/3 of the cars at some point were electric, right? So this concept of electric cars as a consumer has been around, right? So people get it. So if someone tells me that this car is going to run on battery, I get it, right? I don't need to know how a battery works, but I can relate to that. Alternate proteins is a new field, and to your point, Dr. Fatima, that we are using a lot of terms: smart protein, alternate proteins, lab-based meat, animal-free meat, cell-based. There's so many terminologies, right? So I think one learning for me is that and maybe would like to understand from you that this consumer understanding is the start point, right? And they should relate to what it means, right? So I think that has been my learning, and I keep wondering that how did alternate proteins evolve so many different terms, and could we do better by really aligning across the board, right? So that's just a comment. But my main question was that with EV, the concept was validated for so many years, right? And it went on the road and it came off the road because of oil prices, and so on and so forth. Today, it's very focused on cost, bringing the, fixing the battery and the safety. In alternate proteins, we have risks along the value chain, from sourcing the materials to the technology, de-risking, consumer adoption, customer offtake agreements, and so on and so forth. So from a VC standpoint, it just seems like there is very high risk in the alternate protein business. But in EV, you mentioned that there are still a lot of challenges for getting funding. I just wanted to get your opinion that from a VC standpoint, established market, a lot of government support. So there's a lot of things that de-risked already. So what are the VC feedback for the EV industry, right?
Okay, so first of all, when you said that at the point of time there were a third of the vehicles on the US roads were EVs, that was probably because there were not many vehicles on the road. For EVs have been around for over 100 years, and we are still solving the same problem as to why they lost out the race in the first place, which is convenience. From day one, EVs were a better tech in terms of technology, in terms of experience also perhaps, but not in terms of convenience. The reason why they lost out was you could refuel a tank in like 2 minutes. Oil was available, but charging a battery and making sure that you have the right range and the right performance was missing. We are still solving that. So from a VC point of view, if you think of it, yes, it's an established market where EVs have lost out a few times. So it's actually a risk. It's not like the risk has been de-risked before. What is understood is that some parts of the value chain have been de-risked, and there is only one part which is remaining, and that is that is the core focus. If someone wins in that, you win big. When it comes to feedback, again, I mean, over the past 3 or 4 years, it has changed very, very rapidly. Back in early 2021, no one wanted to touch EV because EV was still the future. It was not present. Okay, by late 2021, early 2022, everyone was focused on EV. No one wanted to touch battery. Because again, battery, you're talking of something that is too futuristic. EV, the market is already there. But again, I mean, by then we had already raised funds, but like by 2023, mid of 2023, the market had evolved to the point where there are so many EV players, you don't know who's going to win, and hence no one wants to bet on EV OEMs anymore. But there are very few players who are actually in the space of making core components. And suddenly that becomes, the area of interest for everyone, because whoever makes core components is going to give the components to everyone in the market. And suddenly that became a very, the area of focus. Whenever we spoke to VCs, okay, are you making batteries? Then they were suddenly interested in batteries. But that's been changing very, very rapidly. And it has been changing rapidly because suddenly EVs went from, it's the future, but we don't know when that future will come. That was pre-pandemic in 2020 and before. To suddenly after the pandemic, everyone started changing the way they were perceiving products. Honestly speaking, there is no reason why you should switch to an EV over an ICE because there was a pandemic. I mean, it does not make any rational sense per se, but we see that, sales picked up. The same FAME 2 subsidy was there before as well. The same FAME 2 subsidy started getting adopted very quickly, and people started making, a lot of EVs started getting sold. I remember I used to make trips to Bangalore in 2019, 2020, and the number of EVs you could see on the road were like maybe once in a day, and you're like, oh, there is an EV. That scooter is an electric. Today, I came from Whitefield to Indiranagar. I don't even know the number of EVs that passed us. I actually don't keep track anymore. I don't keep count anymore. We were on an EV. We came on an electric scooter today. And it's become very commonplace. So things have moved very fast. And hence, the focus has also moved very, very fast. Now, what happens next probably, and this is it's very difficult to speculate. But, and I guess Vikram can answer that better. But we are at that tipping point. We are at that 5% mark. Most successful technologies have scaled up super fast after hitting 5% adoption. And there is a selection bias over here because we only look at successful technologies. What we don't see is most of the failed technologies also hit 5% and they could not ramp up. So what will it take to, cross that threshold and be successful from 5 to 50% probably? So that technology would hold the key to the future.
Yeah, maybe if I can add a little bit to the feedback from the capital markets, right? So, see, essentially what has happened over the last 15 years is that the price has dropped down rapidly. It has dropped down to 10% of what it used to be, just from a lithium-ion battery perspective, right? When you take that, India was largely a country which bought Chinese products and assembled it. and sold it in the local market. And this is not just true of EVs, it's true of every industry in the hard asset space in India. So that's how the market started out. But after capital, and to this day, out of all climate companies funded, EV still garners the lion's share of the funding, right? But where's the capital going? That's the question. The capital is going mostly to assembly companies till this point of time. And as the battery prices keep dropping, new problems are arising in the market, such as you don't find good quality batteries. You have geopolitical risks of depending on China for most of your material requirements or rare metal requirements, which goes into the batteries. And you still are dependent on other countries for oil imports, right? So geopolitics, cost curve, all of this also play a part into what sector becomes successful from a capital intake perspective. Not just technology working. It's not just about the technology working or making sense. It's also about whether the price point can be achieved. And now these problems, like Apoorv says, has been surfaced in the market, so capital is going into batteries. It's only a matter of time till we figure out that we need to create our own cell lines and have advanced chemistries. And that wave of investments will happen over the next 5 to 10 years, right?
Thank you. Unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions, but you can find the speakers outside, hopefully. No running away. So with that, thank you so much for joining us for this panel. Thank you for bringing your insights, and thank you for the community for joining us. We hope this was useful, interesting. We will be publishing some learnings from today's event because we had some discussions before this panel, and hopefully you'll find that on our page, on Terrarium's website, and on the GFIdeas community page. So thank you so much.